Hello and good evening, everyone. Are we on? Hi, am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay. Welcome to TAP, the art platform India, and to TAP Talks. I'm Mala Aneja, one of the gallerists on TAP. I run Art Motif. Thank you for joining us. We're delighted to have you all with us today. As you may already know, TAP India is a collective platform which brings together 15 galleries to collaborate and explore newer viewership and open doors to conversations on art and art practices. TAP intends to create a space for candid conversation between artists, collectors, people from the industry, talking about their experiences and their engagement with art. The conversation on TAP Talks today looks at Indian textiles in the contemporary practice and patronage. We have three very accomplished panelists here with us today who will discuss the importance of textiles as one of the most prominent aspects of Indian artistic expression and throw light on how textiles are being viewed from the perspective of contemporary art ecology. I would like to welcome Lekha Poddar, philanthropist, art collector, and patron. She is the founder of Textile Arts of India, a society formed to promote excellence in traditional Indian handlooms. Lekha is also the founder of the Devi Art Foundation and has been the co-chair of the South Asian Acquisitions Committee of the Tate Modern London since it was formed in 2012. A warm welcome and thank you to you, Lekha. We are so pleased to have you with us today.
Thank you.
We're also very happy to have Renuka Reddy with us on Tap Talks today. Renuka, a Bangalore based artist, explores the historic traditions and techniques of chintz that propelled it into becoming one of the most important textiles from India. She has a background in textile arts, in textile crafts in India, and automotive textiles in Detroit, USA. Renuka's exquisite works are in several museum collections around the world. We had the privilege of hosting the first solo show of her chintz artworks at the gallery in 2017. Welcome, Renuka. A great pleasure having you with us. Thank you for joining us at Tap Talks today. We welcome Mayank Mansingh Kaul, a Delhi-based writer and curator with a focus on post-independence histories of textiles, fashion, and design in India. We have very happily worked together with Mayank on a few occasions, including a wonderful residential lecture series by him on Indian textiles in Landor in 2019. Mayank will be leading the conversation today with Lekha and Renuka. Thank you so much, Mayank. We are very happy to have you with us on Tap Talks today. During the talk, should the audience participants have any questions for the speakers, please message us on the chat box and the questions will be answered at the end of the talk. Please maybe also request you all to keep your video turned off and the audio on. Thank you for that. Welcome once again, Lekha, Renuka, Mayank. Over to you now, Mayank.
Thank you so much, Mala, Sharan, the entire team at TAP for so warmly inviting us to do this and to give us a chance to talk to each other. I've had the great pleasure to collaborate with several. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I've had the great pleasure to collaborate with several participants of talk, and of course, I'm absolutely delighted to be doing this with Lekha and Renuka, two people that I greatly admire, and whose journeys and pursuits have been such a source of inspiration for me. Lekha, we go back a long way. I started my career literally with, as many of us do, with Lekha. With my first project in textiles was with Lekha, and we've had again the opportunity to collaborate on a number of projects. I've had the pleasure to travel with Lekha to see India in textiles. We've had riveting conversations, and it's really such a pleasure to be able to do this in a more formal capacity, Lekha. And Renuka, from the first time I saw your work at Gallery Art Motive, your solo show, I've been riveted by your work, your single-minded focus, and I'm really glad I've had the opportunity to have spent some time with you, understanding your work and how you see it also within a larger context of artistic practices in India, the subcontinent and the world. The question of contemporary is something that is has obsessed us for several decades now. It is a fairly well established field and network of discourse within the visual arts field, where the film, in various forms of artistic pursuits, and somehow in textiles, because in India we have very long traditions of making, which go back several thousands of years, hundreds of years, centuries, decades. This question of what is contemporary in Indian textiles, what is traditional, has been something that has engaged many of us as writers, curators, other scholars, practitioners, as well as people like Lekha, who've actually developed formats to be able to enable conversations around this. So we thought that this would be, since TAP is largely geared towards a contemporary art audience and engages with galleries involved with multiple forms of contemporary, it may be worth trying to attempt an examination, an exploration, and a conversation on what that has meant. So we're basically going to be looking at, from what I like to see, a larger, broader perspective of how the idea of contemporary has been approached from um, the perspective of patronage or enabling, like I said, formats and structures for curatorial conversations around this. Lekha has presented 3 textile exhibitions as part of the Devi Art Foundation's work. Mala mentioned that she's also the founder of the Textile Art Society, which in Banaras has been doing incredible work that we'll see. So that helps us understand how one can kind of envision this idea of the contemporary from a broader scope of structures. And to juxtapose that, we have what again I'm really looking forward to is a very deeply personal pursuit of Renuka, looking at it from a relatively more micro perspective of practice. And hopefully, moving between these two sort of ends of the spectrum, we'll be able to later open up this discussion and invite more conversation about how do we start looking at this idea of the contemporary. So I'm going to switch on my presentation. Instead of each of us, the 3 panelists, getting devoted time, what we thought would be nice is to structure this as a single presentation where each of us comes in at different points. And like Mala said, I'll sort of lead this and invite Renuka and Lekha to engage and participate at certain moments. And I'm just going to share screen now so we can start the presentation. Is this visible?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm just going to quickly move right to the beginning. And just to help us place, what we're going to talk about in the moments that Lekha and Renuka represent within a broader perspective or arc of when textiles were engaged with a certain kind of newness and exhibited, displayed in a sort of different way for its time. I thought it would be nice to sort of, in the process, also bring up some historical moments. An important moment that comes up in the showcase of Indian textile and hand manufacture are the colonial exhibitions in London, which took place in the third quarter of the 19th century, and which perhaps for the first time really organized a way of looking at Indian textiles. A hugely controversial series, a subject today, which looks at how the idea of India has been shaped in the West. But nevertheless gives us a starting point to start thinking about how textiles outside of their function as home furnishings and apparel, as well as within their functions as apparel and home furnishings, were projected to the world. And so you have one image of representing the London exhibition of the third quarter of the 19th century. We then move on to a very interesting moment in post-independent India where you have Corbusier designing Chandigarh, and this whole idea of international modernism coming to India or being received in India or being developed in India as an Indian modernism through a response. And Corbusier's tapestries, he, as part of the Capitol complex in Chandigarh, he developed and designed a very important series of tapestries that you see here, which were actually woven by traditional Panjadari weavers in Punjab. An entire workshop was set up in the 50s and 60s for their production, and perhaps gives us one insight into post-independent India, an early moment when textiles as public art, as architectural pieces, as intrinsic to that kind of design statement that Corbusier, Chandigarh, and Nehruvian ideas of India were making, and how these textiles were intrinsically a part of that. We then move on to, just to go a little back to talk about one instance of the interior design of Manik Bagh Palace in Indore, which was designed by the German architect Eckhard Muthesius. And this was for the Holkar family, Maharaja Yashwant Rao II in Indore, and how he invited Muthesius to design this starkly Art Deco interior for what largely was a colonial Indo-Saracenic building from the outside. And if you look at the rugs here, or the carpets, which were by Sylvain de Bruns, a rug maker and textile artist in Paris, just to start sharing some moments of where, textiles leaped out of what they were, within quotations, in their traditional format. And there were these occurrences of the new within the Indian context, in sort of what we largely call the modern period. This is, of course, from the late 20s and the early 30s in Indore. Another image of the living room of the Manik Bagh Palace, and you see these extraordinary carpets, which subsequently have made their way to auctions and important collections around the world. In 1955, another moment that I'm adding into this arc is a seminal exhibition that takes place at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It's called Textiles and Ornamental Arts of India. This is a time that, anti-European colonial sentiments are at their height, and a very, very ripe time for Indo-American diplomacy initiatives in various fields, whether science, architecture, design. And at this point, this exhibition goes to MoMA. Is designed by the legendary American designer Charles Eames. The cultural Pupil Jaikar, a leader of the cultural field at the time, writes for the catalogue of the exhibition. And it's, like I said earlier, it's presented as Textiles and Ornamental Arts of India. Interestingly, because it's part of a cultural diplomacy series of initiatives, an exhibition on American and European design comes to India at this point in Delhi and is seen by millions of visitors. And it's an interesting point because for an Asian country emerging out of the colonial phase, where we're sort of looking at this binary which is being created of textiles still being the ornamental decorative arts and not design, and American and European design, which is of an industrial nature, of a different kind of aesthetic. And this binary is interesting because I think it's something that hasn't left us even today. We still receive textiles as ornamental decorative arts. Visual art galleries largely don't like to show these, considering they're too traditional. So these are conversations that were really seeded then, and these binaries of design, craft, and how textiles in India have remained within the handcrafted, the kind of ornamental decorative arts kind of mode. And I think 1955, this exhibition being reciprocated in 59 with the show on American design in Europe, was a very seminal, in my view, sort of moment to examine how these constructs and hierarchies were developed. Another parallel thread that was being sort of seeded, and which continues till today, was the formation of institutions through the central government. So when we talk about patronage and questions of introducing innovation, newness, contemporization, whatever you call it, in the field of Indian handcrafted textiles, were through central government initiatives like the All India Handicrafts Board, All India Handlooms Board, which were largely empaneled with the mandate of generating livelihood in rural India. And I'm showing this image, which is a quick image picked up from an immediate Google search on Pochampalli sari. And ikat in India today, I mean, Pochampalli is synonymous with ikat saris in silk, in cotton, an entire genres of different kinds of ikat material which are made. But in the 50s, until the 50s, 40s, 60s, Andhra was not producing saris in ikat in the way Pochampalli and other centers are producing today. They were largely producing telia rumals, they were producing rugs in ikat, and initiatives like the contemporization or reimagination of Pochampalli ikat were sort of led by these government institutions. Weavers from Andhra Pradesh were sent to Banaras to learn how silk could be introduced into the ecology of Andhra in ikat. The introduction of sari as a format, looking at it as a popular product in India, were introduced. There were other instances, the baluchari in Bengal, which hadn't been made in its conventional way for several decades, were actually for almost half a century actually, in Bengal, was revived or introduced or developed a new tradition of in Banaras in the 50s, and people like Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay and Jasleen Dhamija were involved. So there was a lot of this kind of movement. When we look at textile crafts, we think of regionality, we think of geographical indicators, we think of these traditions being rooted, but we often forget how intrinsic and inherent movements of material, of ideas have been historically and in the more recent years of these visual and material ideas, and can we pose this as, even if it is within the realm of draped garments, of apparel, home furnishings, an idea of what is contemporization, where textiles which were otherwise known for communities were owned, culturally owned by certain areas, start moving and making connections with other areas and practitioners. And is that something that we can start looking at as another thread of this newness or contemporization that starts seeping in? We're then looking at another thread, just to add to the kind of layers or threads through which different moments and streams of innovation, newness, ideas are being introduced into the Indian subcontinental imagination of textiles. You have the birth of institutions like the NID, the National Institute of Design in Ahmedabad, and I'm showing you a work. It's a 1960s print design by someone called Helena Perintupa, who was a Finnish designer who actually came to India, to Ahmedabad and the NID in the 60s, and helped establish the textile design department of NID. She taught for 20 years, and the sort of initial visual and material ideas can be seen as coming from a kind of Scandinavian root. And we've discussed, considering I myself am from NID, a lot of us at NID who graduated have constantly discussed whether we've sort of been trained or initiated into a way of looking Indian in textiles that that imbibe this kind of European modernism to begin with. Moving on then, to artistic practices, I'm showing you the work of an interior project by someone called Shona Ray. She was from the Royal College of Art. She graduated in the 50s. Her master's thesis was on the influence of Indian historical prints on European prints, and comes back to India, is involved in the initial stages of setting up NID's textile department. She sets up the library there and goes on to then introduce, like we see in this image, at a time where interiors in India were extremely European and have the colonial hangover, a craftiness. The craft element is introduced in urban Indian interiors, and many people have attributed Shona Ray's involvement in this. So we're actually seeing an image shot by Madan Mahata of Shona Ray's own home, giving us an idea of how the idea of that tactility of the handmade starts being juxtaposed with early expressions of modern art, with as you see traditional furniture, which is then upholstered in new ways. Ideas of low seating, which have been traditional to India, but then are introduced in a contemporary setting, and so on and so forth. and to just run you through again with a few practitioners of this time in the 60s, 70s, and 80s who express differently, are occurring, I mean, are sort of expressing some very, very new ideas in Indian textiles which haven't been seen before. In many cases, they're using what we might call conventional traditional techniques. In this case, the design of a pavilion by Ritin Mazumdar. Again, he trained at Shanti Niketan. He worked with the Swedish company Marimekko, and then comes back to India, becomes one of the co-founders of Fab India, the iconic Indian brand, in the sense that he was responsible for its early textile designs for furnishings, cushions, bed covers, while the daris were being designed and developed by Surya Hassan Bose in Andhra Pradesh. An example of his calligraphic work. In later years, he left Delhi. He went back to Shanti Niketan, where he followed this kind of a line of practice. Whereas throughout his career, there was this constant engagement between him as a designer for functional products, him making things as an independent artistic practice, and how all of these worlds sort of move together. The work of Nelly Setna, she was a tapestry artist. She was a textile artist who trained in Cranbrook in America, a very small, specialized, influential school of tapestry weaving, and came back to India. She was from Bombay. She came back to India, again was involved with the NID in its early years, went on to become an educator at Sophia Polytechnic, which has had a very successful textile program and has trained several decades and generations of textile practitioners, designers, and artists in the country. Just to give you an example of one of her tapestries from the early 90s, which was shown at an exhibition at Mumbai's Chatterjee and Lal Gallery a few years back. Monica Correa, again a Cranbrook trained artist who came back to India. She was involved with the Weaver Service Center, another network of organizations that the central government had formed to create alliances between practitioners, designers, makers of textiles in the country. Even today, there are about 22 Weaver Service Centers all across the country. This is an installation image from a solo exhibition of Monica Correa's work a few years back at Chemold Gallery in Bombay. The work of Prabhakar Barve. So I'm showing you some of these practices, just very representative, few images per artist, to kind of help you get an understanding of what we receive as multiple threads. You have these independent practitioners who are blurring the lines between what we call today design and the arts, who are participating in revival projects but have studio practices where they express things of their own. You have education and pedagogy, some of them becoming involved with different forms of teaching, which becomes one vehicle of the development of a certain kind of aesthetics. So you have all of these, and of course, at the same time, like I've shared earlier, some of these landmark projects, whether Corbusiers or Muthesius in Manning Bagh, which give us some kind of iconic image as a reference to remember what was going on. So I'm just trying to help you understand that by the 80s and 90s, when this idea of contemporarization really gathers force, we receive all of these ways in which people are participating and engaging with the world of Indian handmade textiles. And it's interesting that when you look at by the late 70s, we have an iconic landmark project till the 90s called Vishwakarma. Those of us in textiles, it's a very, very important reference for us, because this was again a part of India's cultural diplomacy initiatives called Festivals of India. It was spearheaded by Martand Singh, a textile expert who for 10 years had been the director of the Calico Museum in Ahmedabad. And it attempted to revive and document, to begin with, do a survey of Indian handmade textile traditions across the country, and then document them, and at one level try and reproduce in the contemporary then, examples of masterpieces from museums, and at the same time to push this idea of newness within them as well. So this is a review of the first Vishwakarma exhibition, Master Weavers in India magazine. And what was interesting for me is that by the time Vishwakarma really happens, if you look at the catalog, if you talk to people who participated in, they were largely executed by the Weaver Service Center. What was interesting is that you don't have this emergence of the idea of who's a contemporary artist or a designer, who's a traditional craftsperson, and all of them who is a technician or an artisan, and all of them are functioning together to create these commissions and projects happen. So it's a sort of very interesting moment, and I want to bring Lekha here because Lekha, I know that through several conversations over the last 10-15 years that we've known each other, you've spoken about how when Vishwakarma happened, it was an interesting moment for you. You talked about how there was a new energy in Delhi. There were designers who were setting up studios. There were early artists exhibiting. Galleries were coming up, and you found yourself in the middle of all of this exciting activity. So, can you share with us what was it like to be around Vishwakarma and what was going on? You went on to buy some of the Vishwakarma textiles as part of the exhibition staged in Delhi, where they were being offered for sale. Help us understand what was the milieu of the time and how that got you interested in the world of culture.
So, as I've often said, that I don't came from. I didn't have a background in art, textiles, or any of that. I had a friend, Aman Nath, with whom I was trying to do another project, but then sort of dragged me to a place called Shekhawati in Rajasthan, from where most of the Marwaris from that whole area of Shekhawati, most of the Marwaris come from. And he said, no, you have to be involved with this project because it's where your roots are and things like that. And we became very, very good friends. And over years, he introduced me to artists and art and culture and all kinds of other things. And in the course of all of these sort of, sojourns that we had, he introduced me to Martan Singh. And he was fondly called Mapu, and Mapu was very busy doing these Vishwakarma exhibitions. As you've turned around and said that, post-independence, that there was a surge at a certain point with Corbusier and all the other independent practitioners and Fab India and everybody else, which was interesting. I mean, they were doing contemporary textiles, but I think the idea for Vishwakarma was that, first was because I think the deterioration of textiles production by and large in India had really become quite deplorable, because I think people, in order to survive, were just making, textiles for exports. And the government, I think this was a project again by Popul Jaikar, convincing the government that, there has to be a revival of our textiles and handicrafts. So I think the first few years of the years were spent reviving the textiles back to museum quality, and the second half of the Vishwakarmas, which was post 85, was about actually bringing in design. If I'm not mistaken, at some point in the late 80s, there was an exhibition of Vishwakarma at Ravindra Bhavan in Delhi. And the textiles that had been made for the various festivals of India, I think the weavers were given an opportunity to start selling those textiles, because they were making saris. And at that particular point, it was basically about revival. So you had saris, you had tablecloths, you had bed covers, and you had all kinds of things, which you could use. You could actually they could be, part of your daily life. And it was really quite a treat, because the kind of saris that were revived, or the kind of bed covers, or even tablecloths, or whatever else it was really not available in the normal in the market, because the quality that was trying to be established at this point of time was trying to get the best of the Indian textile weavers, master weavers and all of that. So I think it was a great journey to see these fantastic textiles being displayed, and having the opportunity to be able to buy some of them also, because the weavers had the opportunity to sell them.
Thank you, Lekha. You talk about how, through Vishwakarma, there was this idea of reimagining India's textile handcrafted traditions as new products, both with a new aesthetic as well as material sensibility. What was also very interesting as part of Vishwakarma was that there was a reimagining of these traditions as works of art, as public commissions, as panels, and many of these techniques, which traditions which were, for instance, being used for sacred purposes, or for creating objects for religious rituals, were transformed into textiles that could be used in contemporary interiors at the time. And interesting that you mentioned that you started your journey at the time you met Mapu, and this world in your journey in textiles with Mapu. At the time that you met Mapu, the Vishwakarma exhibitions happened, because almost 30 years later, in 2018, on the first anniversaries of Mapu's passing away, the Deviya Foundation, and you decided to present an exhibition from the Vishwakarma, from the commissions, which are a part of the permanent collection at the Crafts Museum. So these are just to share with you some slides from that exhibition. It was called In Search of Five Directions. It was an homage to Martan Singh, and it was at the Crafts Museum in Delhi, and it exhibited 36 textiles from the Vishwakarma exhibitions. Just to share with everyone, the two Vishwakarma exhibitions that came to India, one was the first Vishwakarma Weavers, which was earlier presented at the Royal College of Arts in London, and then at Rabindra Bhavan in the Lalit Kala Academy in Delhi. And the second exhibition, which was Pushing Frontiers, was called Vishwakarma Kshetra, and it was actually at the Crafts Museum. So that's where the collection then has continued to lay. And would you like to tell us a little about, I can share slides and introduce them. Could you share with us a little about how this idea of the exhibition came together? And then I could run through a few slides. This is a...
So, as you know, Mapu passed away in 2007, and we wanted to pay a homage to him because he had been such an integral part of our lives. So Rakesh Thakur, who was always with Mapu and was designer for most of these textiles, including the first, the earlier Vishwakarmas, which was the revival bit of it. And then he was also responsible for the design of the newer textiles as the different exhibitions sort of continued till 1991. There was Rahul Jain, who's also got the Asha workshop, for which we created the society called Textiles Art of India. And Rita Chishti, who had worked with Mapu over the past 30 years, were the curators. And we thought that if we really had to pay a homage to Mapu for all that he had done for textiles in India, it had to be the best. And we could only get to that if we could, get to this Crafts Museum collection, because a lot of these textiles were there. And to choose 36 textiles, which are the best of the various exhibitions that had happened. So yeah, that's how this exhibition came about. It was really interesting because, as you know, in most museums, a lot of work needs to be done once you've chosen the textiles, all the repairs and restorations and sorting and lining and everything. But yes, it was a fantastic journey to see these textiles so closely and really engage with them over a period of, I don't know. I mean, I think the exhibition ran for 2 months, and then it was many months before that, we were all sort of handling these textiles to see how we could really make the most beautiful exhibition that we could possibly for Mapu.
So the textile that we see here, Tree of Life, it's a reproduction or a reimagination of the Tree of Life. and they produced almost 700 blocks to make it. It was produced eventually at the Mumbai Weavers Center, where a very large group of practitioners came together. The blocks were made in other centers, came together. There was hand painting, so it also kind of a mix of techniques. And the fact that the fact that the devices came from the production centers, but it was all staged together and ultimately produced at the Weaver Service Center in Bombay. So the Weaver Service Center as a vehicle through Vishwakarma commissions, we see as a way to actually bring all of this energy together and to take from the centers, to transform them into new techniques, to experiment with new processes. Another example from the exhibition, a Chanderi panel, which by then had largely become a sari tradition. We perhaps we know that Chanderi got reinvented as a sari tradition with silk and cotton, perhaps around the late 19th century, early 20th century. Before that, it was possibly a cotton tradition of safas and patkas. And here you have another layer to Chanderi being added, where the sari, the traditions and the techniques being used for saris and dupattas are being transformed into works of art like these, and panels which could be used in both sacred spaces as well as, within quotation, secular interiors and architectural purposes. You have a commission by Chota Lal Salvi from Patan, double ikat, where again something that is largely a tradition which largely had lent itself to saris is being transformed into these panels, taking the best from what that tradition has to offer. This Jamdani panel, you see a completely different way of expressing Jamdani from what we know of it as a sari, dupatta, or a tradition to make textiles for apparel, where these birds. This was actually made in Vijayawada. So there's a tradition of Jamdani in Andhra Pradesh. So this was actually made in the Weaver Service Center in Vijayawada. And then you have this extraordinary panel with
108 birds. 108 birds.
108 kinds of birds, and this was, I think, the last exhibition as part of the Vishwakarma series called, and it was an homage to Dr. Salim Ali, the expert of birds in the country. And you have, I think, I have to quickly look, I think Nasir Khan, I have written here, Nasir Khan, H.A. Jabbar worked on this panel. Extraordinary large panel. And Lekha, you have a funny story about this when you were mounting that you were sharing with Renuka and me the other day, if you'd like to share with the group.
Okay, so this, I think the length of the width of this textile is about 30 feet. The length is about 15. The entire exhibition was up. One of the curators, Rita Chishti, has wanted an animation to be projected from this textile of the birds flying off. If you can't see it, but they're just on the opposite side, we needed to have the projector, and there are just two columns in this gallery. And when we had the textile up ready in the exhibition, and tried to get the projector with the animation of the birds flying off, we realized that the textile was, the projector was about 6 foot away from the edge of the textile. So we had to get the entire textile out. It has a metal backing because it's such a heavy textile that we had to cut all that metal, re-weld it, and move this textile 6 to 7 feet on the right, so that the projection could actually go off with the birds flying off the textile. So it was quite a feat, quite an interesting installation.
Well, I have to say, it was an extraordinary exhibition, and I remember the animation, which worked really beautifully, which added perhaps a more contemporary, of today's time element to it. Renuka was talking about it. I mean, was sharing the other day. It would be so nice if we actually had images of the artists working on this commission to understand how they manage this kind of scale. Thank you, Lekha. Thank you for this. And Renuka, if I may bring in here, because earlier I mentioned that one of the things that really struck me about the Vishwakarma catalogs and the way it articulated these practices that were being projected both within the country as well as the world, because these exhibitions traveled around the world. In America, for instance, as part of the Smithsonian program, it traveled to 22 cities alone. So it went to Japan, it went to Sweden, Finland, Russia, the entire world over. And I found it interesting, this idea of that none of them were consciously expressing themselves as contemporary artists, designers. There weren't these kind of categories, and it reminded me of the conversation we were having at the opening of your solo exhibition at Gallery Art Motive, that it was a very conscious decision for you to call yourself, I mean, just to give you a quick detail of that extraordinary panel before we move on to, sorry, quickly, if you'd like to look at this again. And how you consciously chose. I mean, obviously these questions came up. You trained as a textile designer. You worked in the automobile world of textiles, making these highly functional, mechanized textiles in the United States, and then you discovered chintz, and the process of actually defining your practice and yourself within that as a chintz artist, not a visual artist, not a textile artist, not even a kalamkari artist, even though some of the ideas were coming from what is well established today as the ecology of kalamkari in South East India. Share with us, what was this process of arriving and in reflecting and positioning yourself in that sense within what you were doing for yourself and for others? Yeah.
So, I mean, the words chins and kalamkari are, they're essentially the same thing. These words originated during India's trade with Europe and the Middle East, and were used to refer to basically painted and printed cottons. And in the 18th century, English-speaking traders pluralized the word chint, which means, spotted or sprayed, which became cheens, and then it became chins. Whereas kalamkari literally means penwork. And the technique that I use in my work is, I define it as hand-drawn, modern painted, and resis dyed cotton cloth. So I really don't deviate from that. So in that sense, probably kalamkari is a better description, of my work. But I use the word chins deliberately for two reasons. One reason is, to me, chins or kalamkari, it's a set of specific techniques and not a specific design repertoire, and that's why I always highlight the technique. And the second reason is to highlight the differences in the technique used in what we know as kalamkari today, and the techniques that were used historically, because there have been a number of significant changes. For example, when one thinks of painted cottons, it almost implies that dyes are painted on the surface directly. But in fact, historically, all colors except black and yellow, and maybe sometimes with some exceptions, they've actually dyed, not painted. Whereas now, most colors are often painted. So that's I think, to me, a very significant difference.
Great. I love this, because I mean, I find this fascinating, because all over the world, you have the development of this idea of the world of the fiber artists or the textile artists, and just to juxtapose what you were talking about with the work of Ajit Das, who also shows with Gallery Art Motive, and he calls himself a kalamkari artist very consciously, whereas he's actually, he doesn't come from a traditional family of kalamkari artists or from the region, and yet he chooses to call himself a kalamkari artist. And how in India we still were able to have these multiple sort of plural ways of looking at practices, and Ajit Da feels that he's completely at will to be able to call himself a kalamkari artist while working in Bengal, whereas kalamkari is traditionally associated with a certain region in Andhra. So I think it's interesting that we're still not, or hopefully we'll never be in that kind of a structure where all of us have to call ourselves the same thing to be able to emerge this field of textiles in the way we're engaged. And it's nice that I think we have these multiple definitions of practices. We'd like to just you want to talk about? I mean, maybe it'd be lovely for, I mean, because it's a tradition that really was dead in the country for 2 centuries, the actual technique of making this, and you revived it over 6 painstakingly long years. It's almost, if I'm right, almost a 30-step process from what I can recall. And I mean, what a feat to do that. Could you share with us a little about the process of how you actually discovered sheet
I don't
and
know how old this particular craft is or this technique is. I mean, it's probably more than 2,000 years old, but the textiles that we have are predominantly from, you know, the 17th, 18th century because they were preserved, but we really don't know when it originated. I came across chins about 10 years ago, and this particular slide is an 18th century piece from the V&A collection. And it was this very painterly quality of historic chins, you know, the vivid color palette and the very fine details that actually got me interested in this medium. But I soon realized that this visual quality of historic chins is actually, you know, it's inextricably tied to the techniques used. So if I wanted to, you know, recreate those characteristics that got me interested in the first place, I had to focus and rediscover those very techniques. And you know, and really this opened a world of joy and wonder to me, because even though it was the aesthetic that got me started, it was really the process that got me hooked to it. Well, it's been 10 years and I'm still as inspired as the first day. Because the process of making chins is an extremely efficient, elaborate, and as you mentioned, multi-step process where so many natural materials such as dyes, sheep dung, buffalo milk, they all interact in such a complex way. And you know, while trying to rediscover these techniques, there were some that were particularly challenging to me that I wanted to share today. Can I have the next slide, Mine? So the first one was, you know, how does one get very fine lines when drawing on a cloth? And this is a picture of drawing outlines in alum mordant using, you know, a traditional tool called kalam, or which is basically a bamboo pen. Yes, the skill of the artist is an important factor, but in my practice, I found that, you know, the selection and preparation of the cloth, the cotton cloth, can make all the difference. So in this picture, the cloth has been treated with buffalo milk and myrobalan. Then it is beaten and rubbed so hard that it almost shines like silk. And that makes it possible to draw fine lines without spreading on the cloth. So technique was very integral to getting fine lines. Next slide, please. So one of the characteristic features of historic chins that I absolutely love are, you know, is the fine white lines, because these really give depth and details to motifs. So for example, the lines on the vase and the dots on the left flower are got by drawing wax on the cloth and then painting mordants over it. So the question was, how does one draw such fine lines and wax? I guess more important question is, what is this formula, you know, of the wax that allows it to have such a low melting temperature, but still have a good resist property? And this was a large phase of my research. And after experimenting with, you know, various formulas and studying Indonesian batik practices, I am able to achieve, I think, fairly fine lines. But again, this is ongoing research.
Great, thank you, Renuka.
Next slide.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is my more recent research questions was, you know, dyeing indigo. So historically, how indigo was applied was all the areas that were not blue were covered with wax, and then the whole cloth was dipped in an indigo vat. You know, I was obsessed with the fine wax lines that I talked about earlier for so long that it actually came as a big surprise to me how difficult it was to apply wax on large areas without cracks. And unfortunately, we know almost nothing about how it was done in the past. So again, after much experimentation, I am able to achieve somewhat satisfactory results. So the left picture is, as you can see, the yellow area is where the wax has been applied. And the right picture is after it's been dyed. I think this one is about dipped 8 times in an indigo vat. So the wax is holding quite well so Next slide, mine. So this is one of my favorites, and I think one of yours as well. During the process, the background takes on a reddish tint, and then to get rid of it, cloth was soaked in dung at night, and this could be sheep dung or goat dung or cow dung, and then it is exposed to sunlight until this reddish tinted areas are bleached to white. So the question was, how can I dye cotton in all these beautiful shades of pinks and reds and purples? And then expose it to sunlight, and for days, and I'm talking sometimes weeks if it's a cloudy day, and still retain those bright colors. So this was a very fun phase of research as well. And you were talking about how in Vishwakarma, they were not, they had no pieces which had a white background.
Well, I remember that when I actually saw these works of yours in your first exhibit, in your last and last exhibition, I recall Mapu telling me that this was a process of being able to go back, because all of the dyeing processes, help acquire this layer of color in the textile, and that through the Vishwakarma interventions, they could actually go back to the bleached background. But I also recall you telling me that it took months of research on what the sheep was eating to get the right kind of dung for you to actually bleach it, right?
Well, it was, it basically meant studying dung practice, studying moderns. It was a combination of dyes. And that's why I keep going back to this technique, because it's not one material or one technique, because all these materials interact in such a complex way, and each of them requires a more intensive study. So.
Great. Renuka, I had the opportunity to show your work at an exhibition called New Traditions, Inspirations and Influences in Indian Textiles 1947 to 2017 at the Jawahar Kala Kendra, which I had the opportunity to curate. It was designed by Reha Sodhi in Jaipur in 2018. And I decided to juxtapose your work with this work of Rahul, because at a time that we're sort of used to making this division between what is the thematic or conceptual and then what's the technical. Somehow I find both your practices, yours and Rahul Jain's, that I'll briefly now talk about, the pursuit of the technique itself, which is not really just about skill or technique. There's something more. And needs to be seen as part of this of the discourses which qualify something to become art in the first place, in that sense. And what you were doing, of course, has often been seen as reproduction, but you're also reimagining the formats, the motives, the coloration, and all of this. So there's a reimagination. It's really not a technical reproduction in that sense, and it's really a revitalizing of the tradition, or adding to the tradition in that sense, from a broader historical perspective. So I wanted to now talk a little about Rahul Jain's workshop. We mentioned earlier that Lekha helped set up the Textile Art Society. Rahul Jain, a World Bank economist, came to India enamored by these Mughal patkas that he saw in a museum in America and decided to reproduce them. Like Renuka, he encountered an ecology where these textiles, these very complex weaving techniques which had been produced in Safavid Iran and Mughal India, Samites and Lampas, had not been produced in India again for about 2 centuries, and went about a long process of several years, almost 7 years, of actually remaking the loom, and in the process reimagining what these techniques could be for the 21st century and India. So this is one of the first pieces, Lekha. This is from your collection, and you very kindly lent it to us for the Jawahar Kala Kendra exhibition. And I'd love to bring you in here to talk about how you got interested in Rahul's work, how you met, and how the idea of Textile Art Society came up. And we will share some aspects of the work that you've been doing through the Asha workshop.
So if you see this textile that you're just showing, I don't think anybody can turn around and say that you haven't fallen in love with this textile. This was really one of the first textiles that I saw from of Rahul. Rahul was a friend of my brother, and his father, Rahul's father, was a friend of my brother-in-law, and he was also known to a common friend of ours called Krishna Ribu. And of course, Krishna ji and Suresh Bhai Sahab, my brother-in-law, when they saw Rahul's work, they were equally, they were very excited, and they just thought that this was something that we could not sort of let go past. He had revived the 16th to 17th century Safavid, at this point, it was basically the Safavid, Iran and the Mughal textiles. He just made a few of them in Banaras, and we had to, everybody had to put their heads together. And of course, he was Mapu's friend. So Mapu, Suresh Bhai, and myself, we decided that we'd form a society so that we could, fund this to a certain degree and allow Rahul the financial freedom to be able to pursue his creative freedom, have creative freedom, so that, he wouldn't be constantly bothered about selling and the finances as to how these looms going to be financed and this thing. So that brought about the founding of the Textile Art Society for the purpose of helping this absolutely incredible revival to continue.
I remember this is an installation image of the first exhibition that you did, Meenakar. 14 jewel textiles glowing in this absolutely black room in the National Museum. I remember it was a small room next to that exhibition, Enduring Image. It was 50 years of India's independence. It was 97. I was all of 15, and I remember meeting Rahul here, and it pretty much started off my journey. So I have many thank yous to you, because but for this show, I wouldn't have got interested in Rahul's work and be doing what I am today. But I remember standing in this room, Lekha, and being absolutely mesmerized. The weavers who had woven these textiles were standing next to them in these beautiful, pristine white kurtas. Rahul was talking about the process of exactly this, not reproducing as is, but actually imbibing the spirit of these textiles, which themselves were a cosmopolitan mix of so many cultures, eras, aesthetic influences, and actually that cosmopolitanism reflecting in this idea of the contemporary that he brings to what is otherwise seen as mere reproductions. Tell us a little about this show. I mean, it was just, if I recall, it traveled to other cities as well.
Yeah, it went to Mumbai and it went to Calcutta and then also to the British Museum. Rahul had by this time over the past, he had obviously produced a few textiles prior to 94, 95, and then subsequent textiles of another, I think 8 or 10 or whatever they were, which he had produced. We thought that, it would be great for the world to turn around and see, what level of technical excellence was being sort of established in this workshop. Because I think Rahul didn't compromise on any of the technique and the yarn and the zari making. He might have been inspired by design from other places, as we talked about, from the Safavid courts or whether from the Mughal courts or whatever it is, but the technique was as it would have been possibly in the 16th, 17th century. So that was totally uncompromised. And and we thought that the world should really see what is being achieved in India. So this was a small exhibition, as you said, 14 textiles in one room. And instead of sort of painting the room, and since we did think that we might be able to take this textile to Mumbai and to Calcutta, we created a tent within the room. So this, what you see inside is a black tent. And yes, some of the textiles were vertical, some lay horizontally where you see the weavers standing there. And some did go onto the wall, few of them, because you actually couldn't hang too many from, there was actually no wall. So these were hanging from rods of the tent. Yes, it was
just to give you
exhibition. It's called Meenakar and it looked like Meenakar.
So one of the things that Rahul has spoken about constantly is how what excites him in his practice is when a textile leaves its fiber-like, within quotation, fabric or textile quality and becomes something else. In this case, he said that they'd become sculptures because they'd almost become like enameled objects. Just to share with everyone another detail of the patkas from the Meenakar exhibition.
Just
The
look at
rev-
the fringe. Just see the fringe.
yeah, and the reverse of the textile you see on the right side. And again, Lekha, as it seems many things come full circle for you 20 years later after you presented Meenakar. These works were shown as part of an incredible exhibition last year, sorry, 2019 at the National Museum called Prakashi, and it was in Delhi at the National Museum, an homage to Mapu as well as Suresh Bhai, who passed away, and and you were able to finally show not just the pieces from the original Meenakar exhibition, but also the developments over the last 20 years at the Asha workshop. If you could share with us some highlights, another patka from Meenakar, just for everyone to look at. And at some point, velvet started being made. If you could share a little about some of the other developments that came up
Yeah.
through the Asha workshop.
I mean, I think Rahul progressed from making just silk and brocade to Ottoman velvets, inspired by Ottoman velvets, and uh, uh, and I don't know if you have another slide on this, but the
I have only
progression
one.
the progression of this is where the backgrounds become brocaded, and the velvet continues to remain the way it is. So that was, I mean, that's the way he's progressed, and I think you may be having another slide of his Vatican tap. So, oh right, the tent panels.
Which was in a technique a technique called Lampas.
Yeah, and so this is again a revival of 16th century, 17th century Mughal tent panels in silk. And, and this, I think, was the ultimate, because this was, I mean, his homage to a triptych from I mean, which could have been in the Vatican, which I think has not been in the, I mean, is not from the Vatican, but it is a homage to Michelangelo.
A 16th century mural at the
Yeah,
Vatican. Just for everyone's benefit, a detail of the textile. It's in a technique called samite, and it has extraordinary details of the human figure, which is the first time the human figure has probably been attempted in this kind of a visuality and material and technique. And I also wanted to share that what Rahul and again Lekha, we've discussed it, that these techniques of lampas and samites and velvets were actually never known to have been produced in Banaras.
yeah,
In India, they were known to have been produced in the Mughal workshops, which were perhaps in Lahore, in Ahmedabad, in Chanderi, in perhaps Agra, and the fact that actually Banaras weavers were brought in to actually help have bring back these techniques in a new way as well says a lot again about what we're talking about, how this idea of tradition, contemporization, newness. I mean, this constant interaction. These weavers from Banaras were able to take on the mandate of these techniques, which historically had never known, we know had never been produced in Banaras. Another series of iconic textiles called the Shikargao, where which we had the pleasure to show in an exhibition that we collaborated on at the Devi Art Foundation called Fracture: Indian Textiles, New Traditions. And I just want to share with the viewers a detail of this series of shikargas, where traditionally shikarga as a theme is shows the hunted animals and is found across cultures as a sign of man's victory over nature, in a way, highly symbolic uh, uh, statement seen in royal commissions. and Rahul actually replaces those scenes of hunted animals, whether tigers or deer, with to make a statement today and for today of animals, endangered species of animals. Interestingly, this series of works was nominated for the Jameel Prize 3, which is and you know, and it was shown among other contenders and nominees for the exhibition, which largely attracts visual artists in the contemporary art space working with a different kind of medium. So I think that itself is a very interesting statement. If you'd like to share a little more about the Shikargas.
Well, I mean, I think you told about it all, and it's 5 panels, some in silver, some in gold, and yes, they have different animals, different endangered species, and different panels. So, if you don't look them up close and personal, I mean, you really don't understand. Otherwise, they just look like big, tall panels and in brocade.
He also, I mean, introduced a new visuality to the Shikarga. So the treatment of the repeats that you see is definitely something that you see in historical textiles. But he introduced the motives and the patterns and the way he constructed the Shikarga repeat patterns itself was something quite new. Great. So with that, I'd like to again just bring in Renuka. What we were talking about earlier about so much of Rahul's practice being embedded in the technique and this obsession with pursuing the techniques to its utmost expression. And I thought again it would be a good way to bring you in to talk a little more about your technique and the pursuit and the kind of the universe that actually it is to pursue the techniques, which often doesn't get communicated when you only see the end result of the work. So may I please invite you to share some aspects of this.
The earlier ones, when I talked about bleaching to white and the wax lines, those are things that interventions that were still possible. And here I wanted to focus on a particular one of the very, very important aspect of painted cottons is the dye, and that is a source of red dye. And in this case, it's certainly not exhaustive, but many of the historic chinchons that are attributed to the Coromandel Coast, and especially the exemplary ones, their red has been analyzed, and it shows that they were dyed with shea or shaiva, which is a particular type of madder family. Now, what's interesting about this dye, especially as someone who studies dyes, is that the only source of red in the roots is a compound called alizarin, and this is what, of course, was synthesized later. And when we hear as alizarin now, it's a synthesized version of the coloring compound which existed naturally in shea. Now, what's interesting is that this dye is no longer commercially available in India. So even if one wanted to stick to the technique, this particular, this is a limitation that one has to recognize and then work around it. But a red dye that is widely available in India is Mangista, which contains only traces of alizarin. But it does contain other coloring compounds, which give not just red, but different colors from yellow to orange, but they're not as stable. So it's interesting to still be able to work with an alternative and still be able to, expose a dyed cloth to sunlight and still have those vivid colors. So the picture at the bottom is I think is one of my experiment panels where I studied the effect of, I think this particular one was 7 different variables and how it influences the dyed colors. So I just wanted to share a couple of commissions that were especially challenging to do. So this one was a commission for the Kiran Nada Museum of Art, and the center panel is 5 feet by 9 feet, and I think that's the largest I have ever done. And so I work alone, so there is a limitation of how much or how cloth I can handle. I think the left and the right ones were 6 by 4 feet. So together it was about 95 square feet. And it took me about 9 months to a year to make this particular one. And the center panel, and you were talking about Rahul's work where there were these extinct birds, and I was smiling to myself because the center panel in this also has extinct birds depicted on it. Next slide, mine, please. This one is a more recent commission, and it was for the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. Again, based on a historic piece, but the challenge in this case was the piece that I did for them is only 1/3 the size of the original. And so the challenge was, I still wanted to depict all the fine lines that were there in the original, but still be able to do it in the a smaller scale. So this one took me about 9 months to make. Next one, please. Mine. So I just wanted to talk about, not about technicalities, but really talk about, what my experience has been working with chins for the last 10 years. So I think Indian textiles have such a long history and tradition that working for them, working with them, and I imagine this is for really any artist, there's such a deep immersion in not only the techniques, but often it's an inward journey as much as an outward journey. As you mentioned, my last experience in work was, working with technical textiles, where every property is measurable and quantifiable. And then I shifted to chins, where every material is a natural material which cannot be controlled. As mentioned, for example, the quality of dung depends on what the sheep ate the day before. So it was really a big shift for me. And one of the first instincts that I had to overcome was to try and control every step of the process, which is what that's the way I function. But so this letting go was a really big shift for me. And one of the, I also began to appreciate and observe things that I never thought about before. For example, flowers. So this beauty is from a trip I've taken to Coorg recently. And immediately my mind is thinking about how beautifully those white lines can be depicted in resist lines. So next slide, please. And then lastly, I wanted to say that, I'm talking about letting go of control, but paradoxically, as much as I let go, I do find myself returning to wanting some degree of control. So again, I find this internal tension really fascinating. So at the moment, I am exploring if I can move away from my previous goals, for example, dyeing in indigo without cracks, or really get clean, defined lines. But I want to move away from those goals, but only move as much as I want to. So that's my current exploration. Using historic motifs, using historic techniques, but finding a different path in it between those two.
I'm sorry, I've been getting some messages that there's some blue lines visible on my screen, and I'm sorry, I can't see them, so I don't know how to fix it, but I hope it's not terribly taking away from the experience, because I really don't know how to fix it.
You'll be able to change it, so it's okay.
Renuka, you spoke about this, this idea of really trying to exact the technique and then beginning to kind of think about breaking away, and it kind of resonates a lot with something that Lekha and I closely kind of, along with Rahul Jain and Sanjay Garg and a whole team of curators at the Devi Art Foundation, sort of went through and grappled with while conceiving and executing an exhibition called Fracture, Indian Textiles New Tradition, which was presented in 2015 at the Devi Art Foundation. And it again looked at this idea. I mean, how do you receive the idea of the world of technique, the idea of excellence and pursuit in those techniques, and then how do you kind of explore how that can be broken away with, that can be innovated with, that can be pushed into a future by present processes and interventions. Lekha, you started this idea, you seeded this idea with Rahul in 2006 or 2007, and commissioned several works over the years until Sanjay Garg and myself came on board as co-curators of the project in the exhibition, and then we commissioned for 3 years. And we did an open call, 200 entries. We sampled 25 projects. Ultimately, we showed 19 of them. Would you like to share how that came? It was, we've been told, and the exhibition was received in 2015 as, after Vishwakarma, perhaps the first major considered curatorial intervention in Indian textiles. You were very keen at the beginning that we were not pursuing textiles as functional objects, as home furnishings or apparel. You were very clear that they had to express something on their own and in their own right. And most of them became conversations between a variety of creative practitioners, whether filmmakers, fashion designers, artists, textiles, graphic designers, and people producing these textiles at the centers, and it became those collaborations. Could you share a little about how the idea was? You had Meenakar, then Fracture, you had In Search of Five Directions, and then Prakashi, and then the Asha workshop. So it's been a process, and a very long process of engaging with textiles at multiple levels. You've collected antiquities. So together your collection also represents a very wide spectrum of Indian textiles, from the historical to Fracture, which is really about the contemporary. Also, to share with the viewers, the exhibition came after several seminal exhibitions at the Devi Art Foundation, where the first major exhibition on video art in India, which was the inaugural exhibition, the extraordinary contemporary Iranian exhibition on Pakistan art, Pakistani contemporary art, the vernacular in the contemporary, which was a two-part exhibition, which looked at rethinking this idea of the folk and modern, folk and tribal art as we normally look at them. And then you had textiles. So where did Fracture A fit within your own trajectory and interest? And secondly, how did the idea came about? And we will run through some slides from the exhibition and briefly talk about them. This is an image of a work by Astha Butel, who took, it's a sculpture made with gyasar fabric, and she brings in this idea of pattern making, three-dimensionality in two-dimensional fabrics from her own practice in fashion. So just to kickstart these series of slides, Lekha, on to you.
Yeah, so when we did sort of conceive of Devi Art Foundation, we of course had a collection of contemporary art from all the from not all the countries at that point of time, but that you mentioned. But yeah, over time we built up those collections. But I have always thought that art is a creative. What do you call art? Everything is a creative process. And whether you make videos, or whether you do photography, or whether you do sculptures, or whether you do, paint, as Renuka does, her painting with brush, with a wooden brush, textiles, they're all creative processes. And the thought is that, all of these are interdependent. So you've shown in your own slides, Mayank, uh, practitioners who were using textile as art. So I think Rahul had actually done a project in Kutch with a lady who was living in Kutch at that point of time. I think she was American, Maggie Baxter. And
Australian, yes.
Australian, and he had used the block printing technique there, along with a little bit of hand painting. And it all started there, to say that, that if in India we have all the techniques. You can go from, as you showed in the earlier ones, whether it is in Vishwakarma, whether it is brocading, or whether it is patolas or ikats or printing, whatever you may say. Renuka is doing the chintz. And all of those they're still there. So how could we marry the idea which you started with of technique and design? And I think this was one of the ideas that, how can we make textiles contemporary, and even contemporary art, I mean, to me, art is a pretty subversive word in a certain way, because, all of these are interdependent. But of course, textiles are used for fashion, for our own clothing and whatever it is. But, how do we take this a step forward using our traditions? So that was really the crux of it. And this is Mukesh work, embroidery.
By Charu Wadhwa in Lucknow.
And again, two-dimensional, but looks three-dimensional. Similar to what this thing. Again, this is the technique of panjadari, which is generally flat on ground. And this was woven on this huge loom, I think, which was about 20 foot long, and it was an S-shaped loom. And you can see how the design moves from small to big at the top, and then again moves from in the other side from big to small. The diamond shape patterns.
This was a collaboration between Chandrasekhar Bheda and Mahinder Singh, and the idea to just question this idea of usually a rectangular two-dimensional loom. And in that sense, Mr. Bheda reimagined the loom itself as a circular loom, so that when the textile that came out of it already was sculptural, didn't have a two-dimensionality. So this was a work in Patachitra by Bhikkhu Maharana in Orissa. Normally, we know Patachitra for certain kinds of religious or religious iconic images. In this case, the idea of Lord Jagannath was reinterpreted by Bhikkhu Maharana as this almost kind of this space age 2001 Odyssey, third eye looking into the future, where you see all of these incredibly psychedelic mechanical details. I really think a very extraordinary work. And Lekha, if you'd like to talk a little about this collaboration between Berenice Elena, a French artist, with Sri Niranjan, a fourth generation Kalamkari artist in Sri Kalahasti. I also want to share with the viewers that one of the considered decisions that we took curatorially was that we didn't only invite textile practitioners. We felt that inviting people who even didn't know how to work with certain textile techniques could be an advantage and could provide a new perspective from the outside. So we had filmmakers, we had graphic designers, I've spoken before, we had sculptors, we had a wide variety of creative practitioners. We had a comic artist, Parasmita Singh, who did only a written work on textiles and their changing identities in Assam today. If you'd like to share a little about this work in Kalamkari.
Yeah, so I think technically, I mean, it's a bit like what Renuka had explained, but this is obviously not got a white background, and it's about the spider. Where's the spider in this?
On the left, yes.
Yeah, which starts with which I think most, what is it, the Kalamkari people or the textile people? They use the spider as a first motif.
They trace the origin to the spider.
Yeah, and so this is basically, you start with you might just call it a chakra view with Draupadi's
Sridharan on the one side.
Sridharan sari going through India, and then it goes off, wanders around, and I mean, that's just a very simple storyline of this, but technically it was obviously to do Kalamkari on such a large scale.
And also brought in, if I recall, this idea of a personal narrative of the artist. She talks about her own journey from France to India, about looking at similar metaphors, Penelope's tapestry which never ends and Draupadi's sari which never ends, about encountering these similarities between Greek classical mythology and Indian classical mythology, and so on and so forth. And just to share with the viewers a few highlights from Fracture Indian Textiles, new traditions, and This was Jamdani
Rimzim.
by Rimzim. Yes, like
I
I remember
remember.
going several trips to Rimzim Dadu, fashion designer Rimzim Dadu, who works with experimental textiles in her Noida studio. Over 2 years, this textile was made. If you'd like to share a little about it.
Yeah, so this is a technique of Jamdani, but of course, instead of doing it in cotton, this was the sari is in silicon. And Rimzim cut strips of silicon to be able to weave it into a cloth and create this Jamdani pattern. And it's a full sari, it's a full 5-meter sari.
So this idea of the material becoming that differentiator and pushing it into a new direction. There are several other exhibitions that have taken place which look at, some of the intersections that we're talking about. There was the famous Fabric of India show also in 2015 at the Victoria and Albert Museum, which looked at their historical collection of Indian textiles juxtaposed with practitioners producing at the moment contemporarily, whether as artists, whether as self-identified craftspeople or designers. Currently, we have the exhibition on chintz, which looks at a very broad historical and contemporary trajectory of the chintz and its continuing traditions across the Indian subcontinent at the Royal Ontario Museum in Canada. There have been some wonderful projects by individuals. Lekha Poddar is here from Bangalore. She did a wonderful project in Ahmedabad where these large textiles that she's producing were juxtaposed with mythological, poetic metaphors in Shanti Sadan, which is in Ahmedabad. So, I mean, there have been, unfortunately, we don't have time to discuss many of these projects, but there have been these occurrences, and all of this has led to a situation where we, after a very long time, were able to at least have an ecology or network of people who can bring up some of these questions, whether of terminology, historicity, materials, innovation, and so on and so forth. So I thought just to sort of complete and conclude this kind of an arc or overview that we've tried to create, I could run through a few representational images of some other artists who consciously identify as working with textiles, the late Priya Ravish Mehra, paper collages, as well as Rafugar, which is an art that she has brought attention to. The work of Lavanya Mani. This is from an exhibition that took place in 2019 in Kimold Gallery in Mumbai. The work of Rakhi Peswani, who brings in a lot of materials and metaphors associated with the history, symbolism of cloth, to history, to gender, and so on and so forth. The work of Neha Puri Dheer, a textile designer graduated from NID and has gone on to develop a very special oeuvre of what is seen as an Indo-Japanese tradition today, that of shibori, of tie and dye, and developed this very interesting, conceptual and visual and material language for it. The work of Asif Sheikh, a master embroiderer from Ahmedabad, who has worked to, in many ways, create a completely new technical benchmark for what embroidery can be, and then apply it at a time that is largely associated with the bridal, with the occasional wear fashion industry in India, to statement making works of art which stand in their own right, and the work of Shelly Jyoti. I also want to just briefly mention again a very seminal exhibition which took place in the Bhavdaji Lad Museum in Bombay between 2018 and 2019. It was called Connecting Threads. It was co-curated by Tasneem Zakaria Mehta and Pooja Vaish. And this is a work by Paula Sen Gupta, another artist who works a lot with textiles and brings in different layers of meanings and metaphors and symbolism in textiles. And to conclude, what I found was an amazing juxtaposition between this work by Monali Meher, who intervenes in the colonial aesthetics of the museum, of the building, through the staircase, which is juxtaposed by this work on textile by the contemporary artist Anju Dodia. So just to help all of us get a gathering, or to gather these kinds of various threads through the very personal journey of Renuka as a practice, to the kind of structures of patronage, beginning with state-enabled enterprises towards private studios, the role of foundations like the Devi Art Foundation in pushing the conversation in collaboration with other museums, with other institutions. And perhaps with this, we could lead on to a discussion. So I'm going to stop the screen share. And I'm really sorry about these scratches. I don't know how they've come, but I really, really hope that they haven't completely dampened the experience, and we've been able to really appreciate the extraordinary depth and scale of practices in textiles in the country. Yeah. Have I stopped? Is my screen not visible anymore? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I'm going to just look at the questions, and we've got a few comments. Gosh. Ayushi, may I just, I'm sorry if you don't mind, may I ask you to quickly read through some of the questions, because seem to be. There are no questions, Ayushi informs me. So are there any live questions, or we have some comments? Perhaps I could read those. Archana Shastri says, a wonderful thought-provoking presentation. Just curious on what's the panel take is on connoisseurs, collectors or consumers as against revival and innovation, creative and contemporary, the contextual / ritualistic as against the popular. I'm going to read out the question again, and if Lekha and Renuka would like to come in. A wonderful thought-provoking presentation. Just curious on what the panel's take is on connoisseurs, collectors or consumers as against revival and innovation, creative and contemporary, the contextual / ritualistic as against the popular. Lekha, Renuka?
It's kind of impossible. I don't know. I mean, I guess connoisseurs and collectors will obviously go with their eye or with their knowledge and things like that. And if you don't have the revival, then how do you improve anybody's sort of eye to appreciate or differentiate between what is technically better than possibly what is popular?
Renuka?
I guess I will only quote Henry James in this and say that, we work in the dark, we do what we can, we give what we have. Our doubt is our passion, and our passion is our task. The rest is the madness of art. So I do because I need to.
Thanks, Renuka. We have a question from Shema Shamsi. How does one reach out to the resources, tools, and mentors in exploring fabric revival, innovation, and experimentation?
Mayank, maybe you're in touch with a lot more people who are part of the revival world.
Well, I suppose, what we are doing today is a part of that, but also to combine this question with the previous, I think that, whether it's film, whether it's what is called fine arts, commercial arts, whether it's design, these are such established fields that, they've deserved, especially in post-independent India, very consolidated efforts in whether it's in the pedagogical direction, whether it's in curation, whether it's in institutions. And I think what we're trying to really unpack is, how do we start developing that in the Indian textile space? And our idea with this presentation is really not to have conclusive answers about this, but to share these moments within a longer trajectory where we've tried to engage with these questions in our own personal, professional ways. And I think, how do we reach out to resources? I think through formats like these. I do think that sooner or later, we've been speaking about for years, but I think we need to have some kind of a network where these conversations perhaps could happen in a more consistent way. and that we're able to, I mean, in that sense, if I speak for myself, the idea as someone who trained in textile designer and had a studio and then moved on gradually into curatorial and research-based work, the idea was really to create an arc for what could be a reference for post-independent histories of design, textiles, and fashion in India. Renuka is looking at a very, very specific pursuit of a particular tradition. Lekha is looking at how to create those conversations between textiles, which she loves, with other pursuits in the creative field that the foundation has represented interest in, whether, like I said, whether it's the vernacular art, whether it's contemporary art, as well as between South Asia and the international community. So I think the idea is that we're really trying to see if we can all work together more, if we can create a more consistent way in which these interactions can happen, and that there is a point at which all of us can come together to have references. I mean, just the fact that we're questioning what is the contemporary in Indian textiles, what is the traditional in Indian textiles, how one can choose to resist this idea of a textile artist and call oneself a chintz artist or a kalamkari artist. I think these are, or a weaver in that sense, as Monica Correa loves to call herself. I think these are very interesting ways in which we can perhaps develop a very original Indian or Indian subcontinent pursuit for the ecology of the handmade Indian of the ecology of handmade textiles.
I have a thought, I mean, which is just my thought, to say that, um, even the viewers who are on this platform today, if one could start to look at textiles beyond just a garment. I think if just that many people engage and think and say, what else can one do with the traditions that we have in our country? How can we push that forward? I mean, even if we just start that conversation, I think a lot can happen.
Great. Just to read out a few more comments. Anjali Devi Dayal. Hi, will the talks be available and accessible for research after today? Thank you. Yes, I believe TAP is recording this, and this will be available as a resource, as a link to view later. Ayushi Mathur has responded. Hi Anjali, the talk will be available on our Facebook page and IGTV for viewing at the Art Platform India. Sangeeta Dudhoria comments, hi Renuka, good to see you and hear you again. Sangeeta, hello from all of us. Vibha Mitra to everyone, fascinated. Aarti Serene, it is so fascinating, repertoire of knowledge, you are Mayank. Thank you so much, Aarti. You've been a part of this process, so I'm so glad that we could share this with you. Salima Hashmi, hi, this is Salima Hashmi from Lahore. Would love to share with students here. How does one access the recording? Most of Indian sites are blocked here. How do we manage to overcome that? Salima ji, I think we should request the TAP team to be able to help address your concern. For everyone's benefit, Salima Hashmi edited an iconic, really amazing publication, bringing all of us together on textile practices across genres, media, from the perspective of today, which looked at South Asian practices. It was for a Bangladesh-based art journal. Sharan says, I'll send it to you, Salima ji there. Kalpana Parekh, hello Kalpana auntie. Very interesting seminar, all the participants and the images outstanding, thank you. Sujata Parsai was a curator at the Tapi collection, a very important private collection of textiles. Stunning visuals even from the screen, very engaging talks too. Mayank, thanks for sending me the link, Sujata. Charu Sharma to everyone, thanks for this wealth of information. Charu was associated with Fab India, was a key person for my research on Ritan Mazumdar, whose work I showed when I was researching his work in the Fab India archives. Sangeeta Dudhoria, again, very well presented, Lekha and Renuka. Geeta Khanna, who wrote the book on 10,000 Years of Indian Style. Thank you for this absolutely fabulous presentation. Stunning work by Rahul Jain, and my first of Renuka Reddy. So beautiful. Very good evening, Lekha ji, and my warmest regards. Lots of love and warm regards, Mayank. So good to see you after a long time. I think that's about it. So I've read all the comments. Thank you all for so warmly receiving this, and I really hope that we can continue this conversation through other formats. So if I have Ayushi and Mala and Sharon's permission, may we call it a day? Thank you, Lekha, so much. Thank you, Renuka, and really look forward to doing things with you moving forward.
Thank
Pleasure.
you so much, Mayank. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.